It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We're going to start a series now that's kind of an experiment in how Americans can talk to each other better in these polarized times. So much of the talk around the country's 250th anniversary this summer was about that polarization, right? Among the worst periods in the country's history for that. And that polarization was just taken as a given by the time we reached July 4th, that America 250 was an America that's coming apart. So we're trying an experiment that we're calling America 251 to see if we can't be a place where people talk better to each other as we move forward in time, not long for a nostalgic past from any point of view that may or may not have even been real. Maybe we can make a small contribution to not having as much political violence in our country as we have right now. Some people even suggest we're heading toward a new civil war. Maybe we can do a little to help avoid that. There are also so many hate crimes being committed now. The city of New York, for example, as some of you know, has reported hate crimes rising this year and in recent years, while other kinds of crimes have been going down. What we won't do in this experiment is pretend to have consensus or common ground where those things don't exist. The idea isn't to avoid conflict necessarily. It's to talk better about our differences and approach people who disagree with us in good faith, not in the name-calling, enemies list style that is so prevalent today on social media. And maybe something like this helps just a little over time to get our country closer to cultural and policy outcomes that respect as many people's identities and interests as possible. Some of you have heard the spots we've been running that invite listeners who felt proud of our country on the 4th of July or felt more ashamed of it to engage with each other for today's segment. We do have our first pair of listeners who we will meet in a few minutes. First, though, we'll welcome a guest who's been an influence on us in creating this series, the journalist and conflict mediator, Amanda Ripley, author of the 2021 book, High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. She also writes a Substack newsletter along these lines called Unraveled. We'll talk about Amanda's work, and she will help facilitate the conversation with our pair of listeners with all the experience she's accumulated doing things like this in her work. Amanda, thanks for helping us launch America 251, and welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm excited to be here.
Your book is called High Conflict. You contrast it with a term you use throughout called good conflict. How do you mean those terms?
Well, one thing I've learned is that there are different kinds of conflict, and many of them are really good and healthy and useful, right? But there's a special kind of conflict, which we're seeing a lot of today, which is when conflict escalates to a point where it really kind of takes on a life of its own. And in this state, we behave differently. We make a lot of mistakes. We literally lose our peripheral vision. And the worst part is, in high conflict, we always end up damaging the thing that we care most about, right? Whether it's our family or our country. So that's high conflict. And it's kind of like a perpetual motion machine. Like it's a cycle that is, if you just do what's intuitive, you will feed that cycle, and it's very hard to stop. There are ways to stop it, and we'll talk about that, but that is the kind of conflict that leads to violence. That is the kind of conflict that leads to perpetual war of different kinds, and it generally leaves everyone worse off to different degrees.
So what's good conflict? Because some people may be hearing a description of high conflict and think, well, we want to avoid conflict. We want to have consensus. We want to have agreement.
Right. This is the problem, right? Is it feels like those are our choices. Like we either avoid conflict and sort of suppress what we really think and try not to talk about politics. And that's what, most people are doing. Like 2/3 of Americans say they just don't talk about politics with their relatives, and understandably so, right? But it feels like those are our choices. We either have dysfunctional, intractable conflict, which is what we see a lot of on the news and on social media, or we just are silencing ourselves and censoring ourselves, and those are not good options, right? So good conflict or healthy conflict is the kind of conflict which is unpleasant, like it's uncomfortable. It's kind of like exercise, right? We know that every biological organism needs stress in order to perform at its best. And the same is true in relationships, right? We need that pressure of being challenged, being pushed, and then we also need to be able to push and challenge others. And so for me, I think about it a lot like in a marriage, right? Like you really can't have a relationship, a long relationship, without conflict. And the research on this is that, couples who stay together a long time and are generally happy do have plenty of conflict. It's just that they leave those conflicts closer than they were before. They don't leave them further apart. And so there's a different dynamic at work in that kind of conflict.
And your book includes high conflict to good conflict examples from various contexts within families and other personal relationships, within workplaces, religious congregations that had experienced conflict within, and various explicitly political contexts. I'd like to ask you to describe one of the encounters in the book that was more of a getting to know sort of project, which is, kind of like what we're going to do at the beginning of this here. It paired some liberal Jewish women from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I think is how you describe them, with some conservative Christian corrections officers from Michigan for a series of gatherings. Can you describe how that came about, who visited whom, and with what goals?
Yeah, it's a wild story that started at B'nai Jeshurun, which is a large synagogue on the Upper West Side, where a New Yorker who had been there many times and had friends there was at a birthday party there, a gentleman named Simon Greer, and he had this crazy idea. He had this crazy idea that maybe, because it was not long after Trump's first election, maybe there was a way to do a sort of cultural study abroad, like a domestic exchange program, and take a group of congregants from the synagogue where people were generally anti-Trump and generally mystified by how he had won that election, and introduce them to a group of conservative, mostly Christian corrections officers in Michigan, where he was also doing some work. So Simon proposed this to the rabbi, who incredibly considered it, and to his credit, because of his own history of dealing with conflict internally in the synagogue, he knew that the best thing to do to keep conflict healthy is to kind of lean into it. So I'll just give you two quick examples of the people involved in this exchange. So from New York, Martha Acklesberg is one of the people who volunteered to go from B'nai Jeshurun. She's a Jewish liberal academic who lives in New York. She helped start the Women's Studies Department at Smith College, very politically engaged, active in social justice issues, very opposed to Trump, and knew very few conservatives. So Martha was convinced that Republicans were immoral and going to destroy the country. And she got, a lot of sense of purpose and identity out of being someone who cares about injustice and power imbalances. And to her credit, she agreed to go on this, what started as a 3-day in-home visit. So she was literally going with a small group of other New Yorkers to Michigan and going to stay in the home of a host, which was one of the corrections officers named Caleb Follett, Caleb Follett is a Christian conservative who lives in rural Michigan, works at a local prison, politically engaged conservative, loves to debate politics. He campaigned for Trump, but knew very few liberals. So, as you can see, kind of the opposite of Martha in many, many ways, but also he was convinced that Democrats were immoral and going to destroy the country. So he was invited to participate, and he said he would host as many New Yorkers as he could in his home with his wife and children. And so he hosted Martha.
And they both started out in their bubbles, it sounds like. How'd that turn out? Well,
luckily for me, I was allowed to come and go witness this. Rabbi Madelon invited me to come. And so it was very interesting talking to both groups before this visit started, because both of them started having real cold feet. Martha was having trouble sleeping. People were asking her if she was crazy, like what, maybe something bad was going to happen to her. She's a lesbian in a long relationship with a woman. She was, wondering if this was just a really kind of suicidal move and really questioning her decision. Meanwhile, Caleb back in Michigan, people were telling him he was crazy. He was going to have a bunch of Antifa coming into his house. Like, what was he doing? And so he also and his wife were wondering why they agreed to do this. So there was a lot of fear on both sides. And it was really interesting to listen to that fear and how similar it was, and to think about how we got to this place where people who speak the same language, in this case, they're all white, right? In this case, they have a lot in common, and they are very frightened of each other, probably more frightened than if you sent them to do a study abroad in another country. It's like how we got here is wild. But anyway, to their credit, they did do it, and it was very well set up by Simon Greer, and there was just a few rules of engagement, which was we're going to take seriously the things that other people hold dear. So we're not going to mock and humiliate each other, right? And another one was we're not going to try to change each other's minds, which is probably the one they violated the most, but is a very, very important one to go into these conversations with.
And that's what we're going to do here, too, when we bring in our two volunteer listeners in a little while.
Exactly.
Right? We're not going to put them in the position of trying to change each other's minds.
Which is really, really hard. I mean, it's very easy to get sucked into, even if you go in thinking, I'm not going to try to, I'm not going to try to change their mind. It's very, very hard to stay there. And that's okay, but you have to keep coming back to the realization that you want to change their minds, but you cannot. That is not how you change people's minds. For anyone who's been paying attention over the past 10 years, we are terrible at persuasion. We think we know how to change each other's minds, and we do not, right? So we can talk more about how you actually change people's minds, but it's not in these sort of one-off encounters, and it takes a long time. And you have to start, paradoxically, by being very clear that you are not trying to change their minds. So that's what they did. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, by the way, we have a text from somebody that says, "Hi, Amanda, it's Robin. I was one of those Upper West Side women, and it was an amazing trip." So,
my gosh, that's amazing. Hi, Robin.
Tiny, short number of characters testimonial. So that story, let me tell our listeners, is contained in a chapter of your book, High Conflict, a chapter called Complicating the Narrative. What do you mean by complicating the narrative?
Well, the thing that happens when you allow yourself to actually get in conversation under the right conditions with people you profoundly disagree with and do not understand is that it makes it impossible for you to hold on to the simple caricature that you had in your head going into that conversation, which creates some dissonance, it's kind of annoying because you want to believe that you know good and evil and that you are on the side of good. But as soon as you meet people and really start having genuine conversations about hard things, but also not hard things, you start to find yourself liking them in some ways against your better instincts. And that's exactly what happened with Caleb and Martha. So, we got there, we met in this sort of corrections office, and we went to a prison museum, which was fascinating, and heard about the lives of the officers, which most of the New Yorkers knew nothing about, and was very revealing because a lot of them had done a lot of work on what it's helping inmates, but never really given any thought at all to the lives and work of corrections officers. And then we went and got ice cream. Then they went to a shooting range. I mean, there was a whole series of, and Martha and Caleb really found themselves liking each other despite real differences. And then they also felt the pain that comes with really disagreeing with this person you really like. That night, Caleb showed Martha his gun collection, which is extensive. And it just made her feel so sad because for her, those guns meant something very different than they did to him. And when you care about someone and you start to like them and you get along, you don't want to feel that wedge open up between you, right? It's uncomfortable, but because you have some affection for the person, it prevents you from totally dismissing them as sort of subhuman. So that's what I mean in the long answer of complicating the narrative.
And I want you to talk for a minute about how some of that applies to journalism. And a note to our listener participants who are hanging on, we're going to take a few more minutes with Amanda Ripley for this, kind of good faith, we hope, introduction to the experiment. So Mark and Helen, hang on for just a couple more. But in that chapter, Complicating the Narrative, some of that you apply to journalism, which had been your profession and obviously is what my organization does. You wrote that journalists' definition of conflict has narrowed to a sliver. Journalists' definition of conflict has narrowed to a sliver. How do you mean that?
Well, a lot of the ways that we see conflict and controversy covered in the news is really boring, I want to say at this point. Like, it's very, he said this and then she said this, and it's sort of like middle school gossip. Whereas, interestingly, and my friend Tina Rosenberg has written about this, if you look at really good TV shows these days, the conflict is much more complicated, right? I mean, the most interesting conflict is sometimes internal conflict. It's not just like what Trump said to whom. You know what I'm saying? Like it's really interesting to get into, for example, the understory of conflict, which is the pieces of the conflict that are never discussed, like the thing underneath the thing, which is usually when we're fighting about, crime or immigration or taxes, we're also really fighting about respect or power and control or fear. I mean, fear is the understory of most conflicts, but we in the media very rarely ask about that, right? We very rarely kind of dig into that. But that's really interesting and really important, because until we can figure out what the understory is for me and for you, then we can't have the right fight. And we get pulled into a bunch of nonsense fights, right, that go on forever and kind of feel repetitive and boring, because we're never addressing the deeper root issues or the understory. And so that's what I've been, the past, 5 or 10 years, I've been really experimenting with different ways. And I think this is where what you're doing today, right, is experimenting with different ways to cover controversy and disagreement that are not only more useful, but more interesting.
So just one follow-up to that. There's a potential journalistic danger in that you address. You write, complexity should not be used to obfuscate, to reject accountability. Not all conflicts are complicated, you write. So one might ask, as a devil's advocate, isn't it Pollyanna-ish to be looking for common humanity between individuals when the real job of the media now should be shining a light on, pick your thing, fascism or corruption or inequality and greed? How do you guard against that as a journalist in the context of complicating the narrative?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, like you just said, I mean, some things are simple. Some things are not complicated, right? I mean, that's important to note. And the role of accountability, of shining a light on injustice, on authoritarianism, that's incredibly important. And it doesn't work if people don't trust you, right? And this is what we keep seeing over and over again. It doesn't matter how many Freedom of Information Act requests you file and how many exposés you do and how much evidence you have that someone is lying or harming the country. It doesn't matter if people don't trust you. So there's a foundational problem here that I think it's easy for a lot of, especially national journalists, to ignore to their peril, right? Which is all of that power that journalism used to wield, wants to wield. None of it matters if we are not in relationship with our audiences. So I think we have to do all those things, but do them differently.
So let's bring on our listener volunteers. And as I said earlier, some of you have heard the spots we've been running that invite listeners who felt proud of our country on the 4th of July or felt more ashamed of it to engage with each other for today's segment. And we do have our first pair of listeners, and we're very grateful for their interest in engaging. We'll just go by first names, let me say, so nobody gets doxxed or anything like that. And we chose two people who have certain similarities in their family backgrounds for today's first experiment, some background similarities, but who are maybe in different places today on how they're feeling about this country. They're also both in the 70-plus age group. So joining us now are Mark from Manhattan, self-identified to us as a Republican. He wrote that his parents were Holocaust survivors, and he doesn't support everything the U.S. does, but also feels America is underappreciated in the world. And we have Helen from New Jersey. She wrote to us that her parents met in Russia as involuntary guests of Joseph Stalin, is the way she put it. And she wrote she is so glad they didn't live to see what's happening here today. So hello, Helen. Hello, Mark. Thanks so much for being listeners in the first place and for joining us on the show for a few minutes today. Welcome to WNYC.
Hello. Pleasure to be here. I'm a regular listener, Brian. Enjoy your program.
Thank you, sir. And Helen, you there?
I am there. I'm here.
Great. So why did each of you respond to our promo looking for someone who's more proud or more ashamed of our country right now? Mark, want to go first?
Pleasure to do so. I mean, as you said, my parents were in the Holocaust. The American soldiers saved my parents. I remember my father telling me about the first time he saw the flag when he was liberated. The American soldiers were so kind to him, gave him food. Unfortunately, he was so emaciated he couldn't eat anything. He became very sick, but they were kind. And I felt that the warmth about America, my parents came to America from Europe, the enormous opportunities to have a family life for my sister and myself. And since that time, I've had a chance to be educated, have a family. And so I feel America has been very a wonderful environment. And that's all I have to say at this point. But
okay, that's all we need to say.
Go deeply into it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. And so, Helen, same question. Why did you respond to our promo invitation? You wrote very ashamed as the category for your response.
I'm very angry. I'm really angry. Yeah.
About?
And well, every day, the list of the things we ought to be ashamed of seems to grow exponentially. And we have returned a person to the world's highest office who, in his first term, thought it was a really great idea to separate children, even infants, from their parents. And then we have now returned the same person to the highest office who can actually measure himself against Napoleon, Hitler, and Stalin. Yeah? So last week I was reading Heather Cox Richardson, and she summed it up for me. She was quoting LBJ, and she said, "A country can be known by the quality of the men it honors." And I think that really explains why I'm ashamed.
Would you talk a little bit about your family's experience? Because both families came from Europe. Mark, from the context of Holocaust survivors, as he was describing a little of, and Helen, as I said, introducing you, you wrote to us that your parents met in Russia as involuntary guests of Joseph Stalin. What did you mean by that, very briefly, and how does it inform the kind of anger you were just articulating?
I would like to add something because Mark and I have more in common. My mother's parents and her younger brother and sister died in the Holocaust. They either died in a concentration camp or in the Warsaw Ghetto. So we're much closer than just through the European experience. Yeah, and I guess I picture my father, who had served a 10-year sentence in the Gulag, sitting on the beach in Asbury Park when he told my mother he felt like he was born in this country. And then I think about someone who has instituted a practice of setting quotas for arrests, which is exactly what happened under Stalin. Right? I'm so glad he didn't see it.
Amanda, I want to bring you into this, and I know one of your dialogue techniques is to have participants in conversations restate or echo back some of what they heard from the other. Would you like to take over and lead our guests through a version of that for this next
Sure.
little stretch?
Yeah, no, look, I think let's just call this what it is. Like, we're doing something pretty radical here, like pretty countercultural. And so, Mark and Helen, I really, I just admire that you did this, that you are breaking the walls that are dividing us and are stating out loud your differences. And it's hard to do that. It's really hard. And what I heard from you, Mark, tell me if this is right, I heard a deep, deep sense of gratitude for this country, a sense of pride. You said the word warmth. All the opportunity that has given you and your parents and your children. And that feels like a really genuine and important part of who you are. Do I have that right?
Well, I think it's more than that. I mean, I do respect, and this is what I want to emphasize, Helen's feeling, and that's very understandable from her situation and what she's thinking, her life situation, similarly my life situation. However, I do think that since the basis of this dialogue was whether you're proud or ashamed of America, as I said, and as Brian in my little forum, I don't agree with everything, but I do believe that that this country is extraordinary in terms of what the Founding Fathers put together, our adaptation, what we do in terms of our freedoms, our Bill of Rights, and how the system functions, because even at the highest levels of government, the Supreme Court will come out with a decision, for example, on birthright citizenship, on which I totally couldn't fathom how that could have been put out as an executive order. It makes absolutely no sense. And the Supreme Court came along and said, no way. No, we're not doing that. We're not changing the Constitution. So what I'm trying to get at is, to me, the key here, and this goes back to your scenario and your issue of conflict, is that the idea of respect and civic discourse is very, very important, and staying away from what the Founding Fathers talked about, which is factions, polarization, silos. We have too much of that, maybe not enough good conflict, which you talked about, lots of high conflict all over the place, all the time, and the media feeds on it. So we never get a chance to really
Mark,
get a good discussion.
I don't want to interrupt you. I want to amend what I said earlier when I was trying to loop you or summarize what I heard, because it sounds like it's important to also note that you don't think everything the country does is perfect, and that one of the things that is important to you to communicate is that we have institutions that check and balance each other, and founding concepts that keep us from our worst instincts. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't say about the worst instincts is a very astute point, because if you read the Federalist Papers, if you read the Founding Fathers, and particularly Hamilton and Madison, they basically thought people had vices. They really have problems. Right. Human nature is imperfect, and that's what they want to fix.
They warned us. Right. Yeah, they warned us of this exact
Exactly.
outcome.
If angels run the show, then you don't need a government. And I wanted to just cite, because I don't want to forget the story of Lyndon Johnson.
Before we go to that, Mark, I want to do for Helen what I just tried to do with you. So, Helen, I can hear in your voice such heartbreak.
Yes.
Right? Anger, shame.
Yes.
It's almost like you're aghast at what you're reading in the headlines. Every day, it's like another thing. And the story of your father in Asbury Park, I think you said, feeling like he was born here. So there's like this deep love that feels almost like it's been betrayed.
No, not almost.
Okay. It has been betrayed.
Yes.
Yeah, which is so painful. And I can hear that in your voice. And I thank you for sharing that. And I want to just, let's take a breath here and just point something out. I mean, there's a lot of shared history here, as you pointed out, Helen, right? Same generation, New York area, both had relatives who suffered or even died in the Holocaust both listened to this show, both agreed to do this, and are probably questioning why at this moment. and yet you've ended up in such different places, right? Isn't that interesting, right? That there can be such, that you can go through life with so many similar stories in your mind and in your heart, and end up in a very different place. So I wonder.
Yep.
What I want to ask both of you to do, and this is going to be hard. What I want to ask both of you to do is to resist the urge to talk here in this moment about the news and events and things we can't control, and talk instead about your own, how you got to that different place, right? From the other person. Like what shaped how you are interpreting Supreme Court decisions rather than the Supreme Court decision. Does that, and the reason I want to do that is because we cannot change each other's minds on this in conversation, right? What we could do potentially is try to understand something we didn't understand before about ourselves, the other person, or the world. So
Can
that
I
to
jump
me
in
is a goal.
just
Go
for
ahead,
the
Brian.
sake of time, and pick up on what you were just setting up, Amanda, and invite our guests, now that you've been listening to each other speak, to see if you have a question. And again, this is not a debate. We're not here to have a debate. I'm curious if you have a question that you might like to ask each other as kind of a last section of this. Helen, is there a question that comes to mind for you?
No, not at the moment. I think I'm just too worked up.
Okay, that's fair. Mark, is there a question that comes to mind for you that
I
you would
mean,
like to ask Helen?
no, and I want to make my point about LBJ, and Amanda said I could. And my point is, compromise is the key to the solution of this problem, because LBJ, for example, a Southern senator, reached out to the Southern senators, became president, and passed the civil rights law. Does that tell you something? Tip O'Neill went and saw Ronald Reagan. They had a scotch, and they worked stuff out. We're not doing that today. Whatever side you're on today, irrelevant. You can work stuff out. You can compromise. And we've always done that in American history. And today we don't do it. And that, to me, is the solution to the problem. Now, how people feel about it, and I have the deepest respect for what Helen feels. I really do. I understand her concern, and I feel for her. I absolutely do. I would never ask a question about it, and I support our right, and that's why, as Americans, back to the purpose of this, being proud to be an American, is that we're having this discussion, which we can't have in many places in the world.
Mark,
and it's a very civilized and wonderful discussion. So to me, compromise, compromise, compromise.
Helen, you told us off the air, kind of to what Mark was just saying, that you often feel like you're in a bubble where most people you know agree with you.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that you wanted to do this. Do you think that, how does that experience of being in a bubble make you feel? More curious about people who don't agree with you, or more wary of them? Amanda brought up fear in the introduction part of this segment, wanting to avoid potential conflict. You tell us.
It relates to fear. It makes me feel safer. So it relates to fear.
And Mark, I'm guessing that as a Manhattan Republican, you don't feel like you're in a bubble where most people around you agree with you.
No. Let me just say something about that. I have a friend. I have many friends, but I have a very close friend, and we sit and talk actually on the Jersey Shore, not so far from Asbury Park, and we sit and talk. And my friend, my dear friend, is diametrically opposed to me on every issue. And you know what? I enjoyed the discussion. I don't want to be in a bubble. I want to hear everybody's idea. I want to see I was going to say to let 1,000 flowers bloom, but I didn't want to give a say-so to Mao. But the point is, let people say what they're thinking and have a discussion, but respect for the other people's opinion. And that is woefully lacking in our discourse today on the media, not your show, Brian, not your show, but in the media today. And I think that is a helpful solution, like what you did at your experiment with the West Siders and the conservatives in Michigan, which is kind of like amazing, that we should be talking to each other. When you talk to people, then you get the idea that you have more in common than you have separate.
So Helen and Mark, thank you so much for engaging and participating with us today. We really appreciate your openness and sort of the risk involved for that matter, and for your time. Thank you very, very much, both of you.
Thank you both.
A tremendous pleasure.
And when we come back in a minute, we're going to debrief what we just heard with Amanda Ripley. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we wrap up this launch of an experiment we're trying and talking better to each other in our polarized times for just after this country's polarizing 250th anniversary. We're calling it America 251. Still with us for a few minutes, one of the inspirations for this series, Amanda Ripley, journalist, conflict mediator, author of the book High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, and author of the Substack newsletter Unraveled. So, Amanda, we had no idea what we would get. Two listeners who were complete strangers and just filled out a form online to volunteer for this. And we picked two people who were similar in age and with somewhat overlapping immigrant experiences, as we heard, as a first shot at a kind of good conflict date. In the future, we'll go more head-on, I think, with people on specific issues. But what, if anything, struck you about that exchange that you might put into the larger context of the work you do in general, or finding a way out of some of the worst polarization in our country?
Well, I'm super curious what your takeaways were, Brian. But I think for me, first of all, it was uncomfortable. I don't know if listeners felt that. I felt like sort of a knot in my stomach. I was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen here, right? And for me, I've learned to actually not enjoy, that's too strong, but appreciate that means we're doing it right. You know, if we're just hearing things we agree with, if we're just hearing people who are just essentially high-fiving each other over and over again, or getting each other extremely outraged about the next thing, we're not breaking out of this trap we're in. And so breaking out of this trap means it has to be a little uncomfortable, not too much, right? It doesn't have to be literally physically dangerous, but it is uncomfortable. We are not practiced in it. You could hear Mark there had more experience routinely talking with people he disagrees with, and he was much more comfortable than Helen, right? Mm-hmm. You could tell that both of them, and this is true of all of us, and this is the step I always skipped as a traditional journalist, you have to make people feel heard before they will even begin to listen. That is just the prerequisite. So what I was doing in trying to summarize what each of them said and asking if I got it right was to at least make them feel a little tiny bit heard in this one moment, because without that, there's nowhere for us to go. And you obviously need more time. You want them to do that for each other, but I hopefully they did feel a little bit heard, and hopefully everyone can think about this as a first step, right? If you want to talk to someone you disagree with, if you feel ready to try this, first of all, don't just improv your way through it. That's a bad idea. Like, think about what your goals are in advance. Make sure your goal is not to change them. See if you can get to a place where your goal is to understand something you didn't understand before, and try to loop or paraphrase them before you say anything, right? That is the homework. It is not easy. But as Monica Guzman at Braver Angels says, whoever is underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your imagination. So if you do not talk to people, they will live rent-free in your head, and you will pay a price. And it will not change this nightmare that we are in as a country. We cannot get out of this trap by segregating ourselves from each other. As William Ury says, there's no winning this marriage. We have to talk to each other.
So these were just two very brave listener volunteers, who stepped up to engage with no particular agenda. Other than engaging and maybe making some of their opinions heard and feelings heard about some things that are going on. How much can these kinds of attempts at empathy building or mutual understanding building work in a political context? I don't know if it can among politicians or interest group professionals whose job is to push for the interests of their party or their side of something. Definitely wouldn't work in the context of covering an election, let's say, where the outcome is binary. But what about in a more sort of formal conflict situation where a policy has to be developed or somehow a culture has to go on without, one group or another being marginalized or disadvantaged? What would the next step be?
Well, I'll tell you who knows a lot about this is mayors and governors in the United States who live in a very different world than national politicians because they have to pass budgets and they have to get things done. And they know their constituents and they see them every day, right? And so there are hundreds of mayors now who have signed on to what's called the Oklahoma City Pledge, which is an agreement to treat each other with basic decency, right? To stop demonizing Americans we disagree with, all in the name of lowering the amount of violence that we're seeing. And so this happens all the time, every day at the local and state level. I also work with members of Congress and their staff, and many, many members of Congress are doing this as well. You just don't see them. You don't hear from them. They are not the ones that are featured on Fox News and CNN. And so it's very hard for them because they're really going against the cultural grain, and many of them are leaving Congress, right? Understandably. So if you want to get things done, you have to do this. There is no other path. And you have to get good at living with that discomfort and maybe even finding it interesting, right? If you want to get attention, then you can keep doing what we're doing on the national level. And I hope, and these are what conflict entrepreneurs do, right? They exploit conflict for their own ends, for attention, for power, for profit. And this is what we've, unfortunately, built our institutions to reward right now. And I don't think we always will.
Conflict entrepreneurs, such an interesting term. Here's one text before we run out of time. Listener wrote, it's kind of funny. It's astounding to me that for two people of different opinions to have a civilized conversation has been elevated to an incredible event.
I know. We're like, this is like Olympic level right here.
I mean,
such a simple thing, right?
Such a simple thing. And yet it seems like an experiment. I framed it as an experiment.
It is. I'm telling you that, man, this is radical stuff right now because we don't see it anymore. We don't see it. We don't see it happen. When we see it happen, it's kind of sanitized and lame, So I admire your listeners and you for agreeing to try it. I think there's a lot that we all need to learn about how to do this. And, I should add that those New Yorkers who went to Michigan, guess what? A few months later, those Michigan folks came to New York City. Caleb stayed in Martha's home, and they went to Trump Tower, and they went to Ground Zero, and they did all the things. They ate kosher pizza. I mean, you have to keep these relationships going.
That has to be the last word. We will do more America 251 in the future. We'll figure out what episode 2 should be. We thank Amanda Ripley for helping us launch, author of High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, and the Substack newsletter Unraveled. Amanda, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. Take care.
Stay tuned.